In our 2020 Vision segment tonight, the state of the Democratic Party when it comes for president. By this time tomorrow night, we will know who qualifies for the third set of debates. Right now, only 10 candidates are in, and to say things are a bit confusing in the polls, well, that would be an understatement. Last night, we told you about that surprising Monmouth poll, the first poll showing Joe Biden was not leading the Democratic field, but rather it showed that he was essentially tied with both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. We wondered if that poll was an outlier. Well, tonight, it seems there's some indication it was. Two more big national polls out today, both showing Biden with big leads. 13 points in Politico's and 7 points in Emerson's. Still, Biden, Warren, and Sanders are clearly at the top of the heap. Kamala Harris remains in the second tier. Pete Buttigieg's numbers now appear to be treading water. For more, let's turn to Seema Mehta. Seema is a political writer for the LA Times and recently was covering the Biden campaign out in New Hampshire. Seema, thank you for a few minutes. I thought your piece was really interesting. It seems that the Biden campaign is caught in kind of a scenario that Hillary's campaign was about 4 years ago. You want to preach electability, but at the same time, you look over your shoulder and somebody else has got a movement going on. Do you play four corners, do you use a basketball reference and try and run out the clock, or do you try and redefine yourself? They don't really seem to have the answer, at least not clearly.
I mean, I think we saw this past week that they were really leaning hard on the electability argument. We saw it both in the former vice president's first television advertisement in Iowa, which showed polls that showed him as best positioned to beat President Trump. We also saw Joe Biden's wife, Jill, explicitly make the case that even if you don't agree with him on everything, he's the guy to take on the president. So I think they have been really leaning into this electability argument, which has been part of his campaign since the day he launched it. But you're right. When you do, when you go to Biden events, you have people who are interested in him. He obviously has some real warmth from people who recall him, as the vice president to President Obama, who recall him for all of his decades in the Senate. But you go to some of these other events, like for Elizabeth Warren in particular, and I mean, you have just really, really excited people, and there's like the excitement level, the buzz. It's you can't mistake it. She's clearly got something going on, and the same is true for a number of these candidates.
You mentioned the Warren event, 15,000 people showing up in Seattle, and to that end, I think Biden's also harmed by the fact that polls show he's not the only guy who can beat Trump. I mean, I mentioned it's not just Sanders, it's Warren, certainly some others as well. They all beat him in head-to-heads, and I think you captured in your piece, Biden's getting frustrated by people nitpicking over things that maybe 8 years ago, 12 years ago, they would have let him give him a pass on, but now everybody's looking for the latest flub, et cetera, or Joe putting foot in mouth. It's getting to him, isn't it?
He seemed palpably annoyed by it when I spent time with him on the trail this past weekend in New Hampshire. At one point he sort of misstated where he had just spoken earlier, and then he sort of turned to the press and was like, I'm not going nuts. Like, I know where I spoke. But that said, it happens time and again. I mean, there was a line this week during the event in Hanover where he sort of, as he was talking about how the assassination of RFK and Martin Luther King, how that impacted his generation, he raised the specter of, what would happen if President Obama had been assassinated, during the 2008 campaign, which is just, you hear those words and it just, it stops you. He tried to explain what he meant, that he was trying to explain, to this generation what he experienced in his generation. But it was a difficult phrase. Then the following day, when he was extolling the virtues and the beauty of Keene, New Hampshire, he talked about his love for Vermont. And these are tiny little things, but they seem to just keep happening over and over and over again.
I've been accused about being a Biden apologist a bunch of times, but even I had a hard time after the mass shootings in both Ohio and Texas. He got both places wrong. I mean, we gave Trump a deserved hard time when he talked about Toledo instead of Dayton, but Biden, he had his equal, if not worse, of a screw up on that front. And I think a lot of us don't want to go where I'm about to, but how much of it is the fact that he's 76 and people are wondering if he's lost something off the fastball? How much of this is the age argument?
I mean, he argues that, and we asked him this directly during a gaggle the other day, and he argues that if voters have that concern about him, fine, don't vote for him, vote for somebody else. When you talk to voters, it is something that they bring up. Everyone ages differently. I'm not a doctor. I can't, I don't have the knowledge to weigh in on this, but you do see, we're talking about a number of candidates who are in their 70s. The president, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. So I don't necessarily know why we're focusing more on him about age than some of the others, but when you talk to voters, it definitely comes up.
You know, you talked to one voter who articulated what they wanted, and I think this guy spoke for a lot of folks in New Hampshire when he said, you know what, I want stability and sanity. I don't want the daily chaos that is Trump. I just get this kind of deja vu all over again from some of the Hillary supporters who said, I just want an adult in the room. You know what, the policy, I don't need to be part of a movement here. Just give me an adult, you know. Do they see the peril in this, especially with a primary voter who says, I'm not going to do the same thing I did 4 years ago? How much does he either have to change the narrative or wait for the rest of the field to burn out?
I mean, I think this is the sort of the quintessential debate in the Democratic Party right now. Do they want to go as, down a sort of establishment safe path, which is what Joe Biden says he's offering? He's offering a return to normalcy. Or do they want to go in a far more liberal path, articulated by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and some of the other people on the debate stage, which involves sort of like really overhauling so many parts of our nation, whether it's our healthcare system, our higher education system. I mean, really big, huge programs. And that this is the debate that Democrats are having as they try to figure out who is the best nominee to take on President Trump.
Are you a little surprised at how much the campaign is willing to acknowledge this is just about electability? I mean, you mentioned Joe Biden. She said, and I'm reading a quote from your piece, you may like another candidate better, but you have to look at who's going to win. I mean, to say that out loud, and again, she's his wife. We're only in August, Seema. You figure the enthusiasm would last a little bit, at least into spring.
Yeah, I mean, it was when she said it out loud, it was definitely an eyebrow-raising moment. But that said, when you talk to voters, this campaign, this election is different than the election 4 years ago. It's different than other elections that I've covered, including the 2008 election between President Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Edwards and all them. Voters right now, they're Democratic voters. The people who are showing up at these events, priority number one is beating the president. And that's true. I mean, I won't say it's true for every single one of them, but for almost every single one you talk to, that is their top priority. And then they get to their policy issues. So I do understand why the campaign thinks this is a solid argument to make. The peril is, if you're arguing I'm the most electable, well, the polls have been going with you largely so far. But if the polls turn against you, it's sort of like your own argument can be used against you.
And do you get the sense, and this is just gut at this point, that the turnout on the Democratic side, regardless of who the nominee is going to be, it's going to be a lot higher than certainly on past precedent just because of who he or she is running against? It almost doesn't matter who the nominee is, and even if they're not inspired, just because they're inspired by how much they hate the president.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of strategists believe. I mean, after 2016, I'm never making like a prediction again, but I do believe Democratic strategists really believe we're going to have exceptionally high turnout in this election, possibly on both sides. But we saw this in the midterms, certainly, which is what resulted in, the House changing hands. So I think they're expecting large numbers, especially among Latino voters, people, voters of color, younger voters who can sometimes be a little unsteady. I think they're expecting large numbers of them to turn out.
Seema, great job. I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much. And coming up next, President Trump, he's back in D.C., home from the G7 summit, which, based on what he said at the press conference, may just be the best for everyone involved. Another Trump event jumps the rails. We'll check what he said and what we're hearing happen behind the scenes coming up next.